The gunshot that tore through the saloon window missed Xander Dalton's head by 3 inches, and he didn't even flinch as glass rained down onto his whiskey. He'd been tracking a cattle rustler named Frank Hollies for 2 weeks through the mountains of Idaho Territory, and the $1,000 bounty was finally within reach, posted right there on the wall beside him in the dingy saloon in Shoshone City. But it wasn't Hollies shooting at him. The shooter was a woman with auburn hair and fire in her eyes, standing in the doorway with a smoking rifle pointed directly at the man Xander had been about to collect. "That's my bounty," she said, her voice steady despite the way her chest heaved from running. "Step away from him, mountain man." Xander slowly turned his gaze from Hollies, who'd gone pale as a sheet, to the woman who'd just crashed his payday. She wore men's trousers and a dust-covered shirt that did nothing to hide the curves beneath, and her green eyes blazed with a determination he recognized, because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. He stood slowly, his 6'4" frame unfolding to its full height, broad shoulders blocking out the lamplight behind him. His dark hair fell past his collar, tangled from weeks in the wilderness, and his muscled arms crossed over his chest as he assessed the situation. "Lady, I've been tracking this piece of trash since he stole 30 head from the Morrison Ranch. I found him. He's mine." "Well, that's real interesting," she said, taking 3 steps closer, her rifle never wavering. "Because I've been tracking him since he murdered my father's best friend in Silver City and stole $2,000 from the bank. That was 6 months ago, so I'd say my claim trumps yours by about 5.5 months. Hollies, sensing an opportunity in their standoff, made a break for the back door. Neither Xander nor the woman fired. Instead, Xander's hand shot out with the speed of a striking rattlesnake, grabbing Hollies by the collar and slamming him back into his chair with enough force to crack the wood. The woman circled around, her rifle now covering both men. "Nobody's going anywhere," she said. "Especially you, Hollies. You've got a date with a rope in Silver City." "The bounty in Shoshone is closer," Xander pointed out, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. $1,000 for cattle rustling. We could split it." "I don't split bounties." She reached into her vest pocket with her free hand and pulled out a folded paper. "And I don't need to. My bounty pays $1,500. Xander's jaw tightened. He needed that money. His supplies were running low, and winter was coming to the mountains. He'd spent the last 5 years living off the land in the Sawtooth Range, taking bounties when he needed cash, avoiding civilization when he could. Towns made him feel trapped, suffocated by all the people and their expectations and their judgments. But 1,500 was 1,500, and if she had the higher bounty, the law would side with her. "Fine," he said after a long moment. "He's yours. But I'm escorting you both to Silver City to make sure you actually collect. Call it insurance on my wasted time." She studied him with those sharp green eyes, taking in his buckskin jacket, the knife strapped to his thigh, the rifle across his back, and the rough, weathered look of a man who lived more with animals than people. "I don't need an escort. Wasn't offering, I'm telling you. 2 days through mountain passes to Silver City, and every outlaw between here and there would love to get their hands on Hollies before he testifies. You might be handy with that rifle, but you can't watch your back and his sorry hide at the same time." Something flickered in her expression, gone too quickly for him to read. "What's your name, mountain man?" "Xander Dalton." Her eyes widened slightly. "The Xander Dalton, the one who tracked down the Sawyer gang last year, didn't realize I was famous. You're not. But bounty hunters talk, and your name comes up when they're discussing people who actually finish what they start." She lowered her rifle slightly. "Sabrina Ashford. You got a first name preference, Miss Ashford. Just Sabrina is fine. And I'm not a miss. Lost my husband 3 years ago. Sorry for your loss. Xander meant it. He knew something about loss, about the kind of pain that drove a person away from normal life and into the dangerous work of tracking wanted men. Don't be. He was a bastard who drank himself to death while I worked myself raw trying to keep our ranch going. She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. I sold the land and bought supplies. Been doing this ever since. Hollis chose that moment to make another run for it, kicking over the table and lunging toward the front door. Sabrina moved like lightning, swinging the rifle butt around and catching him square in the jaw. He dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the floor. She looked down at him with satisfaction, then back at Xander. Guess we're riding to Silver City together then. But let's get one thing straight, I'm in charge of this bounty. You're just along for the ride. Xander felt the corner of his mouth twitch. This woman had fire. Yes, madam. They left Shoshone City at dawn, Hollis tied to his horse and looking miserable with his swollen jaw. Sabrina rode a paint mare that looked as tough as its owner, while Xander sat astride a massive bay gelding bred for mountain work. The September morning was crisp, and frost still clung to the sagebrush along the trail. They rode in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts, but Xander found himself studying Sabrina when he thought she wasn't looking. She sat her horse well, moving with the animal's rhythm like someone who'd spent years in the saddle. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her features were striking rather than pretty strong cheekbones, a determined chin, eyes that missed nothing. She was maybe 25 or 26, he guessed, old enough to have lived through some hard times but still young enough to have fight left in her. He figured he was about 30 himself, though sometimes he felt ancient after 5 years alone in the wilderness. You've got questions, Sabrina said without looking at him. I can feel you staring, just wondering why a woman would choose bounty hunting over something safer. Same reason you chose living in the mountains like a hermit instead of settling down with a wife and a farm. Because the alternative was worse. She glanced at him now, her green eyes sharp. Don't go thinking I need rescuing or reforming, Dalton. I chose this life with my eyes wide open. Wasn't thinking that at all, and he wasn't. There was something about Sabrina Ashford that commanded respect. That said, she'd survived things that would have broken softer people. He recognized it because he'd survived things too. Just making conversation. Well, if you want conversation, tell me why Xander Dalton lives alone in the mountains instead of taking the steady money the marshals offer. I heard they tried to recruit you. Not interested in taking orders, or living in town, or dealing with politics and corruption and all the other garbage that comes with wearing a badge. He shifted in his saddle, his powerful frame relaxed despite the rough terrain. The mountains are clean, simple. A man knows where he stands with nature. And yet here you are, riding into civilization for a bounty. Can't eat honor. Can't clothe myself with solitude. Sometimes a man needs money, and bounty hunting pays better than trapping. They fell silent again as the trail narrowed, winding between rocky outcroppings covered with juniper and pine. The Sawtooth Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Xander knew these mountains like he knew his own heartbeat, had spent countless nights under their stars, had weathered blizzards and hunted elk and found a kind of peace in their vast emptiness that he'd never found among people. But riding next to Sabrina, listening to the creak of leather and the steady clip of hooves on stone, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity, interest, the stirring of something beyond simple survival. They made camp that night beside a stream, with Hollis secured to a tree where he could reach water but not escape. Sabrina proved efficient at making camp, gathering wood and starting a fire while Xander tended the horses and checked the perimeter. When he returned to the fire circle, she'd already put coffee on and was frying salt pork in a battered pan. "You're good at this," he observed, settling onto a log across from her. The firelight played across her features, softening them, and he found himself noticing details he'd missed before. The spattering of freckles across her nose, the fullness of her lower lip, the graceful way her hands moved as she worked, had good teachers. "My father was a prospector, dragged me all over Idaho Territory when I was growing up. Mama died when I was 10, so it was just us. He taught me to shoot, track, survive. Said a woman needed to be able to take care of herself because the world wasn't kind to those who couldn't." She flipped the pork, sending up a sizzle and a cloud of savory smoke. "He died 2 years ago, lung fever. By then, I'd already married and lost Thomas, so I was alone anyway. The bounty hunting was just a logical step. Use the skills I had to make money. He'd be proud of you." She looked up sharply, as if searching for mockery in his words. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "I hope so. What about you?" "You've got family somewhere." "Had. Parents died when I was 15. Cholera. Had a sister, Mary, but she died in childbirth when I was 23. Lost the baby too." The words came out flat, emotionless, because Xander had learned to wall off the pain years ago. "Her husband blamed me for not getting the doctor fast enough. Maybe he was right. Either way, I couldn't stay in that town anymore, couldn't look at the accusation in everyone's eyes. So I headed into the mountains and just kept going." Sabrina was quiet for a long moment, dividing the salt pork onto 2 tin plates. "I'm sorry. That's a heavy load to carry. We all carry something." He accepted the plate she offered, their fingers brushing briefly. Even that small contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. "Yours is just more visible because you're hunting the men who wronged you. Not me. Wronged others. I never knew the men I'm tracking, but somebody has to answer for the widows they leave behind, the children without fathers, the families without justice." She met his eyes across the fire. "You understand that, or you wouldn't be out here either." He did understand. Every bounty he brought in was a small act of redemption, a way to balance the scales for Mary and the life he couldn't save. He nodded, and something passed between them in the firelight, an unspoken recognition of kindred spirits. They talked late into the night, their conversation ranging from practical matters like the best routes through the mountains to deeper subjects like what drove a person to choose isolation over community. Xander found himself saying things he'd never voiced aloud, and Sabrina proved an intent listener, asking questions that showed she genuinely cared about the answers. She shared her own stories, to the disappointment of her marriage, the relief and guilt she felt when Thomas died, the liberation she'd found in finally living life on her own terms. When they finally settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Xander lay awake longer than usual, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the soft sound of Sabrina's breathing. She'd insisted on taking the first watch despite his protests, and he could see her silhouette against the darkness, rifle across her knees, eyes on the shadows beyond their camp. Something about her profile stirred emotions he'd thought long dead, and he forced himself to look away, to focus on the stars overhead and the familiar comfort of solitude. But solitude felt different now, tinged with something like loneliness. The next morning brought trouble in the form of 3 riders who'd clearly been following them. Xander spotted them first, circling around through the trees while Sabrina was breaking camp. He moved casually toward his rifle, not wanting to spook her or alert their visitors that they'd been seen. "Company," he said quietly. 3 men coming in from the northeast. Armed." Sabrina's hand went to her pistol without obvious hurry, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Friends of Holly's, most likely. You ready for this? Always." She moved to stand beside him, presenting a united front as the three riders emerged from the tree line. They were rough-looking men, the kind who made their living on the wrong side of the law. The leader was a scarred man with cold eyes and a Confederate coat that had seen better days. "Morning," the leader called, reining in 20 feet away. His companions fanned out slightly, hands near their weapons. "That's Frank Holly's you've got there. We've been looking for him." "So were we," Xander replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm that came before violence. "Found him. He's spoken for. See, that's the problem. Frank owes us money and we figure the bounty on his head will cover it, so we'll be taking him off your hands." "No, you won't." Sabrina's voice was steel wrapped in honey. "He's my bounty, legally claimed. You want to dispute that? Take it up with the marshal in Silver City." The scarred man's eyes traveled over her with obvious contempt. "Lady, you're out of your depth. Why don't you run along and let the men handle this?" Xander felt rage kindle in his chest, but before he could speak, Sabrina laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or a frightened one. It was the laugh of someone who'd heard that particular brand of stupidity too many times to count. "I'm going to give you one chance to ride away," she said. "Take it." "Or what?" The man's hand moved toward his gun. Sabrina's pistol cleared leather so fast Xander barely saw it move. Her first shot took the leader's hat clean off his head. Her second shot, fired half a heartbeat later, kicked up dirt between his horse's front hooves, making the animal rear. The two companions went for their guns, and Xander's rifle was suddenly in his hands, its report echoing across the valley as he fired a warning shot past the nearest man's ear. "Next one isn't a warning," Xander said, his tone conversational. "Neither is hers. Now you boys have a choice. You can die here over a man who isn't worth the powder to blow him to hell, or you can ride out and live to make better decisions. What's it going to be?" The scarred man struggled to control his horse, his face purple with rage and humiliation. But he wasn't stupid. He could see the deadly competence in both Xander and Sabrina's eyes, could calculate the odds and find them wanting. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Sabrina said flatly. "Ride." They rode, disappearing back into the trees with backward glances that promised nothing good. Xander watched them go, keeping his rifle ready until they were well out of sight. Only then did he lower the weapon and turn to Sabrina. "That was some shooting. My father's training. He always said if you're going to draw a gun, make the first shot count." She holstered her pistol with the same fluid motion she'd used to draw it. "They'll be back, though. Men like that don't forget being embarrassed. Probably. We should move fast, make Silver City before they can regroup with reinforcements." They pushed hard that day, eating in the saddle and stopping only to water the horses. Holly's complained constantly, whining about the pace and the ropes and the injustice of it all, until Sabrina told him that if he didn't shut his mouth, she'd gag him and let the vultures pick at his corpse if they were attacked. That quieted him down. As they rode, Xander found himself increasingly aware of Sabrina's presence. The way she sat her horse with unconscious grace, the determined set of her jaw, the occasional glimpse of vulnerability when she thought no one was watching, quickly masked by that armor of competence she wore. He wondered what it would take to see behind that armor, to know the woman beneath the bounty hunter, and he wondered why he cared. He'd spent 5 years avoiding emotional entanglements, learning to need only himself and the wild spaces. Getting involved with anyone, especially a woman as complicated and dangerous as Sabrina Ashford, was asking for trouble. But trouble had always found him anyway, so maybe it didn't matter. They made camp early that evening, choosing a defensive position in a rocky hollow where they could see anyone approaching. Xander took the first watch this time, insisting over Sabrina's protests. She finally agreed, spreading her bedroll near the fire and settling down with a sigh that spoke of exhaustion. "Thank you," she said quietly, just before sleep claimed her, "for backing me up today. Most men wouldn't have. Most men are fools." Xander checked his rifle, his eyes scanning the darkness. "You're good at what you do. No reason to get in your way, still. It means something." He glanced at her, saw that she'd already drifted off, her face softened by sleep. Something in his chest tightened, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Protection, maybe. Or admiration. Or something deeper and more dangerous that he wasn't ready to examine. The attack came just after midnight. Xander was watching the eastern approach when he heard the slight scrape of boot on stone from the west. He rolled sideways just as a bullet cracked through the space where his head had been, and then the night exploded with gunfire. 4 shapes rushed the camp from different directions, and Xander's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, dropping 2 of them before they got close. Sabrina came awake instantly, her pistol already firing as she rolled behind a boulder. Another attacker went down with a scream. The 4th, the scarred leader from earlier, made it to Holly's and cut him free before Xander could reload. They made for the horses, Holly stumbling and the scarred man dragging him. "No!" Sabrina lunged from cover, running after them with single-minded determination. Xander swore and followed, his long legs eating up the ground. The scarred man reached the horses and swung into a saddle, hauling Holly's up behind him. He just gathered the reins when Sabrina's tackle took him sideways out of the saddle. They hit the ground hard, rolling, and then the man's fist connected with Sabrina's jaw. She went limp, and the scarred man scrambled for his dropped pistol. Xander hit him like a freight train, his muscled shoulder driving into the man's ribs with enough force to lift him off the ground. They crashed into a tree trunk, and Xander's fist, hardened by years of mountain labor, slammed into the man's face once, twice, 3 times. The man dropped, unconscious or dead. Xander didn't care which. He spun to find Holly's trying to mount a horse. Xander grabbed him by the belt and threw him back to the ground with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. "Stay down, or I'll make you stay down permanent." Then he was kneeling beside Sabrina, his heart hammering with fear he hadn't felt in years. "Sabrina! Sabrina, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Did we get him?" "We got him. You're hurt. Just my pride." She tried to sit up, winced, and let him support her. His arm went around her shoulders, and he could feel her trembling with adrenaline. "I should have been more careful. You were brave as hell." "Stupid, but brave." His hand cupped her face, tilting it so he could examine the bruise already darkening her jaw. Rage flooded through him at the sight. "He hurt you. I'll live. Is he dead?" Xander glanced at the scarred man, saw the faint rise and fall of his chest. "No. But he'll wish he was when he wakes up." "Good. We can collect his bounty too." She managed a weak smile, then winced again. "Help me up." He lifted her easily, his arms going around her waist to steady her. For a moment they stood pressed together, her face inches from his, her breath warm on his skin. He saw something flicker in her eyes, saw her gaze drop to his mouth, and then she was pushing away, putting distance between them. "We should secure the camp. Make sure there aren't others." "Sabrina." "I'm fine, Xander. Really." But her voice shook slightly, and he knew the tremor wasn't entirely from the fight. They spent the rest of the night awake, watching their prisoners and the darkness beyond the firelight. When dawn finally broke, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose, they looked at each other across the cold ashes of their fire and didn't speak about what had almost happened. But Xander could still feel the ghost of her body against his, could still see the want in her eyes before she'd hidden it away. They reached Silver City late the following afternoon, leading 3 horses with 3 prisoners secured across their saddles. The town was larger than Shoshone, bustling with miners and merchants, and the marshal's office sat prominently on the main street. Xander felt the usual tightness in his chest as they entered civilization, the press of buildings and people making him want to turn around and head back to open country. But he stayed because Sabrina was there, leading her horse with her head high despite the bruise on her jaw and the exhaustion in every line of her body. He stayed because he wanted to see her collect her bounty, wanted to make sure she got what she'd earned. And maybe, in some part of himself he didn't want to examine too closely, he stayed because he wasn't ready to say goodbye. The marshal, a grizzled man named Cooper who'd seen too many rough years, looked over their prisoners with satisfaction. That's Frank Holly's, all right. And Dale Sutton didn't know he had paper out on him too. Who's the third? One of Sutton's gang, Sabrina said. He participated in the attempted theft of our bounty. I'm claiming him under citizen's arrest for assault and attempted robbery. Cooper nodded slowly. That'll hold. Holly's is worth $1,500 like the poster says. Sutton's worth $800. The other one, call it $100 for your trouble. He pulled out a lockbox and started counting money. That's $2,400 total. You splitting it? Sabrina looked at Xander, something complicated in her expression. What do you think? You had the claim on Holly's. I'd say the bounty's yours. He meant it, even though the money would have set him up nicely for winter. I just provided escort. You saved my life, and you brought in Sutton. That's worth more than escort fees. She turned back to Cooper. Split it even. $1,200 each. Sabrina, don't argue with me, Dalton. I'm too tired and too sore to appreciate masculine pride right now. But she said it with affection, and when Cooper counted out the money, she took her share and handed him his without further comment. They walked out of the marshal's office into the late afternoon sun, suddenly awkward with each other now that their business was concluded. Xander knew he should get supplies and head back to the mountains before full dark. Winter would come early this year, he could feel it in the air. But instead, he found himself saying, "Buy you dinner. There's a restaurant across the street that doesn't look like it'll poison us." Sabrina's face brightened. I'd like that. The restaurant was simple but clean, and the proprietor seemed to know Sabrina, greeting her warmly and showing them to a corner table. They ordered steak and potatoes and coffee that actually tasted like coffee, and for a while they just sat in companionable silence, letting the tension of the past 3 days drain away. "Where will you go now?" Xander asked finally. "There's a bank robber working the mining camps up north. Bounty's 2,000. Figure I'll head that direction, pick up his trail." She cut into her steak, her movements graceful despite the obvious soreness in her body. "You, back to my cabin. Winter's coming and I need to lay in meat and firewood. Sounds lonely. That's the idea." She looked at him over her coffee cup, those green eyes seeing too much. "Is it? Or is it just safer than the alternative?" He should have deflected, should have changed the subject or made a joke. Instead, he found himself saying, maybe both. "After Mary died, after her husband said those things, I swore I'd never care about anyone that deeply again. Caring makes you vulnerable, makes you hurt when you lose them. Easier to be alone." "Easier," Sabrina agreed, "but not better, not really living, and you're alone too, by choice." "Like you." She set down her cup. "Thomas was a mistake I made when I was young and desperate to escape my father's prospecting life. Thought marriage would mean stability, a home, maybe children someday. Instead it meant bruises hidden under long sleeves and a husband who resented me for being stronger than him. When he died, I felt guilty for being relieved, but I also promised myself I'd never give anyone that kind of power over me again. So we're both running. Maybe. Or maybe we're both just waiting for a reason to stop. She met his eyes, and the intensity of her gaze made his pulse quicken. I felt something back there in the camp, after the fight. I think you did too. Xander's hands tightened on his coffee cup. Sabrina, I'm not asking for promises or commitments, but I'm also not going to pretend I don't feel a connection here. We're good together, Xander. The way we work, the way we understand each other, that's rare. And what are you suggesting? His voice came out rougher than he intended, but she didn't flinch. I'm suggesting we stop running, at least from each other. She reached across the table, her fingers covering his. I'm suggesting we see where this goes, maybe nowhere, maybe somewhere we didn't expect. But either way, we face it together instead of alone. Everything in Xander screamed at him to pull away, to protect himself the way he'd been protecting himself for 7 years. But looking at Sabrina, seeing the hope and fear and determination in her eyes, he found himself unable to deny what he'd been feeling since the moment she'd walked into that saloon with fire in her eyes and a rifle in her hands. I live in a cabin at 8,000 feet, he said slowly. No neighbors for 30 miles. Winter up there is harsh and spring comes late. It's not an easy life. I've never wanted easy, I want real. I'm not good with words, never have been. And I've got damage, Sabrina. Things I haven't dealt with, things that might never heal right. Join the club. We can be damaged together. She smiled, and it transformed her face, making her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with the light shining from within. What do you say, mountain man? Want some company this winter? He should have said no. Should have protected them both from the inevitable hurt. But instead he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers, and said, Yeah, I do. They left Silver City 2 days later after Sabrina settled her affairs and purchased supplies. Xander used some of his bounty money to buy extra provisions, knowing that feeding 2 through a mountain winter would require more than his usual stores. They rode north and west, climbing into the high country where the aspens were already turning gold and the nights brought frost that lingered until noon. Sabrina proved to be good company on the trail, comfortable with silence but ready with conversation when the mood struck. She told him stories about her bounty hunting adventures, about close calls and lucky breaks, and the strange satisfaction that came from bringing order to chaos. He found himself sharing more about his life in the mountains, about the rhythms of the seasons and the peace he'd found in solitude. But the solitude was different now. Better. Shared. His cabin sat in a valley ringed by peaks, accessible only by a narrow trail that was more suggestion than road. He'd built it himself over 2 summers, choosing logs from the surrounding forest and fitting them together with skill learned from his father. It was a single large room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows that looked out on meadows where elk grazed in summer and snow drifted 10 feet deep in winter. Sabrina stood in the doorway, looking around with an expression he couldn't quite read. He suddenly saw it through her eyes: the sparse furniture, the lack of decoration, the masculine simplicity that spoke of a man who'd given up on anything beyond basic survival. "It's perfect," she said finally, and from her tone he knew she meant it. "Xander, it's absolutely perfect." Something in his chest loosened. "It's yours too now, ours, I mean. You want to change anything, make it more comfortable, that's fine by me." She set down her pack and turned to face him, her expression serious. "I need to know something. Are we doing this? Really doing this? Because if we are, I need honesty from you. I need to know that you want me here, not just because the sex will be convenient or because you need help with winter chores. I need to know that you see a future, even if you're not sure what shape it takes." Xander closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I want you here, not for convenience, not for help, because in 3 days you've made me feel more alive than I have in 7 years. Because I can't imagine going back to how things were before you crashed into that saloon. Because when I think about winter now, I don't just see survival. I see you sitting by the fire, reading. I see us tracking deer through fresh snow. I see us talking late into the night and waking up together in the morning and building something that isn't just existing but actually living." Her eyes had gone bright with unshed tears. "That's a lot of words from a man who claims he's not good with them. You make me want to try." He bent his head, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Instead, she rose on her toes to meet him, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. The kiss started gentle, exploratory, but quickly deepened as 7 years of loneliness met 3 years of the same. Sabrina's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Xander wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her against his chest. She made a small sound of approval, her legs wrapping around his hips, and he carried her to the bed he'd built in the corner, the same bed that had never held anyone but himself. They made love with the desperate intensity of 2 people who'd been starving without knowing it, learning each other's bodies with hands and mouths, and whispered words of encouragement and need. Xander took his time despite the urgency thrumming through his veins, wanting to memorize every sound she made, every place that made her gasp and arch beneath him. Sabrina was equally thorough, her hands exploring the muscles of his chest and back and arms, her mouth trailing fire across his skin. Afterwards they lay tangled together, her head on his chest and his hands stroking through her unbound hair. The cabin was quiet except for their breathing and the distant call of a hawk outside, and Xander felt a peace settle over him that had nothing to do with the absence of conflict, and everything to do with the presence of the woman in his arms. "I'm scared," Sabrina admitted quietly. "This is everything I said I didn't want. Dependence on another person, the possibility of loss, the vulnerability that comes with caring. Me too." His arm tightened around her, "but I figure being scared together is better than being safe and alone. When did you get so wise?" "About 30 minutes ago when you kissed me and I realized I'd been an idiot for 7 years. She laughed, the sound rich and genuine, and pressed a kiss to his chest. "We're going to make mistakes. We're going to drive each other crazy sometimes. I'm bossy and stubborn, and I don't always listen to reason. And I'm closed off and antisocial, and I tend to disappear into my own head when things get difficult. Sounds like we're perfectly suited for each other. Sounds like it." They spent the next few weeks preparing for winter, working side by side to hunt and preserve meat, gather firewood, and ready the cabin for the months of snow to come. Sabrina proved to be every bit as capable as Xander, and her presence made the work go faster and feel less like labor. They fell into an easy rhythm, anticipating each other's needs and movements, communicating as much through gestures and glances as through words. But it wasn't all work. They took time to explore the valley together, Xander showing Sabrina his favorite spots: the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in summer, the cliff overlooking a waterfall, the hot spring hidden in a grove of pines where they soaked away sore muscles and made love under the stars. She shared her dreams with him, the things she wanted to accomplish, the difference she hoped to make by bringing dangerous men to justice. "Don't you ever miss it?" Sabrina asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her back against his chest and his arms wrapped around her waist. "The bounty hunting, the challenge of the hunt, sometimes. But I don't miss the violence, Don't miss watching men die even when they deserve it. Don't miss the loneliness between jobs." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "What about you? Do you miss it? A little?" Miss the satisfaction of winning, of outsmarting someone who thought they were smarter. Miss knowing I was making a difference, even a small one. She turned her head to look at him. "But I don't miss being alone. Don't miss wondering if anyone would even notice if I didn't come back from a hunt." "I'd notice." The words came out fierce, possessive. "If anything happened to you, I'd tear apart every mountain range between here and Mexico to find you." She smiled, soft and secret. "Good to know I've got a protective mountain man watching my back. Always." The first real snow came in late October, 3 feet overnight, that transformed the world into a pristine white landscape. They woke to find the cabin buried to the windowsills, and spent the morning digging out paths to the woodpile and the small barn where they'd stabled the horses. The work was hard but good, and when they finally returned inside, cheeks red from cold and clothes damp from snow, Sabrina grabbed him and kissed him with frozen lips that quickly warmed. "What was that for?" Xander asked when she finally pulled back. "For being exactly who you are. For making me laugh when I'm cold and tired. For looking at me like I'm the most important thing in your world." She rested her forehead against his chest. "For giving me a reason to stop running." He tilted her chin up, his dark eyes serious. "You're not just important, Sabrina. You're everything. These past weeks with you have been the best of my life. I love you. I know it's fast, and I know we probably should have waited longer before saying it, but I'm done pretending I don't feel what I feel." She blinked rapidly, fighting tears. "I love you too. So much it terrifies me." "Don't be terrified. We've faced down armed outlaws. We can handle being in love. Promise. Promise." They sealed it with another kiss, longer this time, and when they finally broke apart, Xander built up the fire while Sabrina prepared hot coffee and stew from the venison they'd preserved. They ate by the hearth, sharing the single large bowl because neither wanted to break contact long enough to get another, and talked about plans for spring. "We could take bounties together," Sabrina suggested. "Work as a team. We proved we're good at it, and spend our winters here." Xander liked the sound of that. The balance between civilization and wilderness, between action and peace. Could work, long as we're selective about what jobs we take. Only the ones that matter. The dangerous men who need to be stopped, not the petty criminals just trying to survive. She scraped the bottom of the bowl, getting the last of the stew. "And we'd need to be careful, smart. No taking stupid risks just because the money's good." "Agreed. We've both got too much to lose now." The winter passed in a blur of snowy days and long nights by the fire. They read aloud to each other from the books Sabrina had brought, played cards, talked for hours about everything and nothing. Xander taught her to track animals through snow by their prints and scat, while Sabrina taught him the finer points of reading people, of seeing through lies and evasions. They made love frequently, exploring each other with growing confidence and creativity, learning what brought pleasure and what brought joy. There were hard days, too. Days when Xander retreated into himself, haunted by memories of Mary and the baby he couldn't save. Sabrina learned to recognize the signs and gave him space when he needed it, but always made sure he knew she was there when he was ready to come back. And there were days when Sabrina woke from nightmares about Thomas, when old fears rose up and threatened to swamp her. Xander held her through those times, his steady presence and quiet strength anchoring her until the fear passed. They grew stronger together, learning to navigate the rough places and celebrate the smooth ones. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth, they'd built something solid and real, a foundation that could weather any storm. In early April, when the trails were finally passable again, They rode into Silver City to check for bounties and resupply. The town was busy, with miners returning from winter quarters and merchants restocking after the lean months. They were standing outside the general store, loading supplies onto their packhorse, when Xander saw the wanted posters on the wall. There were the usual assortment of thieves and murderers, their crimes and bounties listed in stark black letters. But one poster caught his eye, and he moved closer to read it. Frank Hollis, the man they'd brought in last fall, had escaped custody during transport to the territorial prison. He'd killed a deputy in the process, and the new bounty on his head was $3,000. Xander was reaching for the poster, thinking Sabrina would want to see it, when another poster beside it stopped him cold. It showed a remarkably good likeness of Sabrina, her name printed beneath in bold capitals. And below that, wanted for the murder of Thomas Ashford. Reward, $5,000. He stared at it, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Murder, $5,000. More than his own bounty had ever been, and he'd brought in some of the most dangerous men in Idaho Territory. This had to be a mistake, some error in paperwork or a case of mistaken identity, but the details were too specific. The location, a small town called Hollister, 3 years ago. The victim's name. The description of the suspect, right down to the scar on Sabrina's left shoulder from a riding accident when she was 12. He looked over his shoulder, saw Sabrina inside the store talking to the proprietor about ammunition. She was smiling, animated, alive in a way she never was in those first days he'd known her. Happy, and someone wanted her arrested for murder, wanted her hanged. Xander didn't think. He ripped the poster off the wall, folded it quickly, and shoved it into his coat pocket. Then he grabbed the Hollis poster and carried it inside to show Sabrina, acting like everything was normal even though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Look who escaped," he said, handing her the paper. Sabrina scanned it, her expression hardening. $3,000. That's good money. But Hollis knows our faces now, knows we're coming. He'll be harder to take. We don't have to take him. There are other bounties. We don't have to, but I want to. He killed a deputy, Xander. Someone's father or husband or brother. He needs to answer for that. She looked up at him, her green eyes determined. Besides, we're good at this. Better together than either of us was alone. We can handle Hollis. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her they should head back to the cabin and forget about bounty hunting for a while. But he couldn't explain why without showing her the poster in his pocket, and he wasn't ready to do that. Not until he understood what was happening, what the truth was behind that accusation. So he nodded and finished loading supplies, and they rode out of Silver City together with Sabrina already planning their hunt for Frank Hollis. But Xander's mind was elsewhere, turning over the implications of what he'd seen. Murder. $5,000. Had Sabrina killed her husband? She'd said he died from drinking himself to death, but what if that was a lie? What if she'd helped him along? And if she had, did it matter? He knew Thomas had been abusive, knew the kind of hell Sabrina must have endured. If she'd killed him in self-defense or out of desperation, Xander couldn't bring himself to condemn her. He'd killed men himself, sometimes in circumstances that weren't strictly legal. Who was he to judge? But the law would judge. The law wouldn't care about bruises hidden under long sleeves or a woman pushed past her breaking point. The law would only see murder and demand punishment. They made camp that night in a clearing beside a creek, the spring runoff making the water run fast and cold. Sabrina seemed to sense his distraction, kept glancing at him with concern, but she didn't push. They ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack, and when darkness fell, they spread their bedrolls near the fire. "You're quiet tonight," Sabrina finally said, lying on her side facing him. "Something wrong?" just thinking about Holly's, about how we're going to track him. That's not it. I know you well enough by now to know when something's eating at you. Talk to me, Xander." He should have deflected again, should have maintained the fiction that everything was fine. But they'd built their relationship on honesty, on trusting each other with the dark and broken pieces. He couldn't start lying now. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, no matter what it is." Her expression went guarded, but she nodded. "All right." "Did you kill Thomas?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rush of the creek. Sabrina's face cycled through shock, hurt, and finally resignation. She sat up slowly, hugging her knees to her chest, and stared into the flames. "Yes," she said finally. "I killed him." Xander had expected it, but hearing her confirm it still felt like a punch to the gut. "Tell me what happened." "Thomas was a mean drunk. I told you that. What I didn't tell you was how mean. The bruises weren't just from fists. He broke my ribs once, dislocated my shoulder. Burned me with a cigar when I talked back." Her voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of someone recounting someone else's nightmare. "I tried to leave. Twice. Both times he found me and brought me back, and the beatings got worse. He told me if I ever tried again, he'd kill me, and I believed him. 3 years ago, we had a ranch outside Hollister. Not much, just a few acres and some cattle. Thomas had been drinking for 2 days straight, and I made the mistake of asking him to help with the chores. He came at me with a fire poker, said he was going to teach me to respect him. I grabbed the rifle, told him to back off. He laughed and kept coming." She paused, swallowing hard. "I shot him, center mass. He went down, and I stood there watching him bleed out on our kitchen floor. I could have gotten help, could have tried to save him, but I didn't. I watched him die, and I felt nothing but relief." Tears streamed down her face now, but her voice remained steady. "When he was dead, I packed what I could carry and rode to Silver City. Told everyone who asked that Thomas had drunk himself to death, which wasn't entirely a lie. His drinking killed him, just not the way people assumed. I've been running ever since, staying on the move, using the bounty hunting as cover. I knew eventually someone would piece it together, would put a bounty on me. Just didn't think it would be this soon." Xander pulled the poster from his pocket and handed it to her. She unfolded it, looked at her own face staring back at her, and laughed bitterly. $5,000. More than I've ever earned bringing in actual criminals. There's irony in that. Sabrina, you should turn me in." "That's a lot of money, Xander. More than we'd make in 2 years of bounty hunting. You could use it to improve the cabin, buy better supplies, live comfortably for a long time." He stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You think I'd turn you in for money? Why not? It's what I am. A bounty hunter. What we do. We bring in criminals for the reward, and according to this poster, that's what I am. A criminal." "No." The word came out harsh, definitive. "You're a woman who defended herself against an abusive monster. You're a survivor. You're the woman I love, and if you think for 1 second that I'd choose money over you, then you don't know me at all." She looked up at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. "But the bounty can go to hell." Xander grabbed the poster from her hands, stood, and walked to the fire. He held the paper over the flames, watched it catch and curl, burning to ash. "There's no bounty. There's no crime. There's just you and me and the life we're building together, and no one is taking that away." Sabrina launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him with desperate intensity. He held her, feeling her shake with sobs and relief, and made silent promises to himself about what he'd do to anyone who tried to hurt her. They sank to their knees beside the fire, clinging to each other, and when they finally broke apart, her eyes were red but clear. "Thank you for believing me, for not seeing me as a murderer. You're not. You did what you had to do to survive. There's no shame in that." He cupped her face in his hands. "But we need to be smart now. Someone filed those charges, got that bounty posted. They're looking for you. We need to figure out who and why, and we need to clear your name properly." "How? It's my word against Thomas's family. They never liked me, always blamed me for his drinking. They'd say anything to see me hang. Then we find evidence, proof of the abuse, witnesses who saw what he did to you, a lawyer who can argue self-defense." Xander had no idea how to actually accomplish any of that, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let Sabrina face this alone. "We'll figure it out together." "Together," she echoed, and some of the fear left her eyes. "I like the sound of that." They spent the next few days riding toward Hollister, where the murder had taken place. Sabrina was reluctant at first, terrified of being recognized, but Xander convinced her that running wouldn't solve anything. They needed to confront this head-on if she was ever going to be free. Hollister was a small mining town that had seen better days, its main street lined with buildings in various states of disrepair. They rode in cautiously, Sabrina wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and Xander keeping his hand near his rifle. The local saloon seemed like a good place to start gathering information, and they tied their horses outside before entering. The interior was dim and smelled of stale beer and tobacco. A few miners sat at tables, nursing drinks and playing cards, and a tired-looking woman tended bar. Xander and Sabrina took a corner table, ordered whiskey, and listened to the conversation around them. "You hear Frank Holly's escaped," one miner was saying. "Killed a deputy doing it. That man's got a death wish." "Got a $5,000 bounty on his head, too," another replied. "Same as that woman who killed her husband a few years back." "What was her name?" "Ashford. Sabrina Ashford. Heard she was a real cold one, shot Thomas in the back while he was sleeping." Sabrina's hand tightened on her glass, but Xander put a calming hand on her knee under the table. The story was already being twisted, turned into something darker than the truth. They needed to correct that narrative before it became set in stone. After finishing their drinks, they left the saloon and walked to the marshal's office. The marshal was a heavy-set man named Garrett who looked at them with tired eyes when they entered. "Help you folks? We're looking for information about a case from 3 years ago," Xander said. "Thomas Ashford's death. We heard there's a bounty out on his widow." Garrett's eyes sharpened. "What's your interest in that case?" "We're bounty hunters. Heard the reward was substantial. Wanted to know more about the crime before we took the job." It wasn't entirely a lie, and it gave them cover to ask questions. The marshal grunted and pulled out a file. "Thomas Ashford, found dead in his home 3 years ago this month. Single gunshot to the chest. Wife disappeared same day, hasn't been seen since. Family filed charges when they couldn't locate her for the funeral. Claimed she'd murdered him for his land and money, though from what I could tell, there wasn't much of either." "Any evidence she did it?" Sabrina asked, keeping her voice steady. "Neighbors said they heard fighting that day. One said he saw bruises on Mrs. Ashford's arms earlier that week, but Thomas's family claimed she was clumsy, always hurting herself. Without a body or a confession, it's all circumstantial. But the family pushed hard, got the territorial judge to issue a warrant. That's when the bounty went up." "What about Thomas?" Xander pressed. "What kind of man was he?" Garrett hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, speaking ill of the dead isn't my style. But between you and me, Thomas Ashford was a mean drunk who liked hurting people. I arrested him twice for brawling, and there were rumors about what went on in that house. But rumors don't hold up in court, and his family's got money and connections. They want someone to pay for Thomas's death, and Sabrina Ashford is the convenient target." It was as much confirmation as they were going to get from an official source. Xander thanked the marshal and they left, walking back toward their horses. But before they could mount up, a woman approached them from across the street. She was maybe 40, worn-looking but with kind eyes. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I heard you asking about Sabrina Ashford. You're not really bounty hunters, are you?" Sabrina tensed, but Xander kept his voice casual. "What makes you think that?" "Because bounty hunters don't usually care about what kind of man their target killed. They just want the reward." The woman glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "My name's Helen Murphy. I was Sabrina's neighbor. I saw what Thomas did to her. The bruises, the burns, the fear in her eyes. I saw it and I did nothing to help. That's a guilt I'll carry to my grave." "You couldn't have known," Sabrina started, then stopped, realizing she'd given herself away. Helen's eyes widened. You're Sabrina." "Please," Sabrina said urgently. "Please don't turn me in. I know what people think, but it wasn't murder. He was going to kill me. I had to defend myself." Helen looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you, and I'll help you however I can, but you need to know Thomas's brother Garrett is the one pushing for your arrest. He's convinced the family that you killed Thomas for money, and he won't stop until he sees you hang." "Garrett Ashford?" Xander asked. "Any relation to the marshal?" "No, different families, but Garrett Ashford has influence in these parts. He's a banker in Boise, came back here specifically to make sure his brother's killer is brought to justice." Helen pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "I wrote down everything I saw, everything I heard through the walls. It's not much, but maybe it'll help. I would have come forward sooner, but I was scared. Garrett Ashford isn't a man you want as an enemy." Sabrina took the paper with shaking hands. "Thank you. This means more than you know. Just promise me you'll clear your name properly. That you'll make sure people know the truth about what Thomas was." Helen looked between them. "And be careful. Garrett has men looking for you, and they're not interested in bringing you in alive." They thanked Helen and rode out of Hollister as quickly as they dared, not stopping until they were miles away and hidden in a stand of pines. Only then did Sabrina unfold Helen's testimony and read it aloud. The document was detailed and damning, describing incidents of abuse going back years, listing dates and injuries and the terror that permeated that household. It painted a picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare with no escape. "This could change everything," Sabrina said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is proof. It's a start. We need more, though. We need to find other witnesses, people who saw what Thomas did, and we need a lawyer good enough to stand up to Garrett Ashford and his money." Xander took the paper carefully, folding it and tucking it inside his shirt for safekeeping. "We should head to Boise. That's where the territorial courts are and where we'll need to make our case. Boise is also where Garrett Ashford lives. We'll be walking right into the lion's den." "I know. But we can't keep running forever, Sabrina. Eventually someone will recognize you, will try to collect that bounty. Better to face this now on our terms than to wait for it to catch up with us." She nodded, her jaw set with determination. "You're right. Let's go to Boise. Let's end this." The ride to Boise took 4 days, and they used the time to plan their approach. They'd need a lawyer first, someone with a reputation for winning difficult cases. Xander had heard of a man named Arthur Morrison, who'd successfully defended several women accused of crimes, arguing that the law didn't adequately protect women from abusive husbands and fathers. If anyone could help Sabrina, it would be him. They reached Boise in early evening, the city glowing with lamplight and bustling with activity. It was far larger than any town Xander had been to in years, and he felt the familiar tightness in his chest as they navigated the crowded streets. But Sabrina's hand in his anchored him, reminded him why they were here and what they were fighting for. They found Morrison's office on a quiet side street, a modest building with his name painted on the window. The door was locked, but a sign indicated he'd return in the morning. So they found a hotel, paid for a room under false names, and spent the night holding each other, too anxious to do more than seek comfort in proximity. Morning brought a new determination. They arrived at Morrison's office as he was unlocking the door, and he looked them over with sharp, intelligent eyes. He was younger than Xander expected, maybe 35, with the kind of face that could be friendly or formidable depending on the situation. "Help you folks?" Morrison asked. "We need a lawyer," Xander said. "Best one in Idaho Territory. Heard that might be you. Flattery will get you everywhere. Come in, let's talk." They followed him inside, and once the door was closed and locked, Sabrina removed her hat. "My name is Sabrina Ashford. I'm wanted for murdering my husband 3 years ago. I didn't murder him, but I did kill him, and I need someone who can prove the difference in court." Morrison's eyebrows rose, but he gestured to chairs and took his seat behind a massive desk covered in papers. "All right, Mrs. Ashford. Tell me everything." It took an hour to lay out the full story: the abuse, the final confrontation, the flight, and the bounty, and Helen's testimony. Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, his expression giving nothing away. When they finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. "This is going to be difficult," he said finally. "Not impossible, but difficult. The law doesn't recognize self-defense for women the same way it does for men, especially when the victim is the woman's husband. There's a presumption that a wife belongs to her husband, that he has certain rights over her person." "That's barbaric," Sabrina said hotly. "It is, but it's also the law, at least for now. However, there are precedents. Cases where women have successfully argued that extreme circumstances justified their actions. With Helen Murphy's testimony and any other witnesses we can find, we might be able to build a case that Thomas posed an immediate threat to your life." Morrison leaned forward. "But you need to understand, even if we win, this will be public. Everyone will know what happened in your marriage, what you endured. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to stop running." Sabrina's voice was steady. "I want my life back. I want to be able to live without looking over my shoulder. Then we have work to do. First, I'll file a motion with the territorial court to dismiss the charges based on self-defense. That'll force Garrett Ashford to respond, to present his case. While we're waiting for a court date, we need to gather more evidence. Track down anyone who witnessed Thomas's violence, anyone who can corroborate your story." "How long will this take?" Xander asked. "Months at least, maybe longer depending on how hard Ashford fights. You'll need to stay in Boise, stay available. Can you do that?" Xander looked at Sabrina, saw the fear and hope warring in her eyes. He squeezed her hand. "We'll do whatever it takes." The months that followed were some of the hardest of Xander's life. Living in the city went against every instinct he'd developed over the past 7 years, and there were days when he wanted nothing more than to grab Sabrina and ride back to the mountains, consequences be damned. But he stayed because she needed him, because they'd promised to face this together. They rented a small house on the outskirts of town, far enough from the center to give Xander some breathing room, but close enough to Morrison's office for regular meetings. Sabrina threw herself into building their case, tracking down witnesses and writing detailed accounts of every incident she could remember. Xander supported her however he could, accompanying her to interviews, providing a steady presence when the memories became too painful. Arthur Morrison proved to be as good as his reputation. He was thorough and relentless, finding witnesses. Even Sabrina had forgotten about a doctor who'd treated her broken ribs and had noted his suspicions about domestic violence in his records, a minister who tried to counsel Thomas about his drinking, neighbors who'd heard the sounds of fighting through thin walls. Slowly, piece by piece, they built a picture of a woman pushed past her breaking point. Garrett Ashford fought back hard. He hired his own lawyers, men with expensive suits and powerful connections, who argued that Sabrina was a cold-blooded killer who'd manipulated everyone with lies and crocodile tears. They tried to discredit Helen Murphy's testimony, claiming she was a scorned woman with a grudge. They painted Thomas as a devoted husband driven to drink by his wife's unfaithfulness and disrespect. It was ugly and painful, and there were nights when Sabrina cried herself to sleep in Xander's arms, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But Morrison never wavered, never suggested they give up or take a plea deal. He believed in her innocence, and that belief sustained them through the darkest times. The trial was set for late October, almost exactly a year after Xander and Sabrina had met. The courtroom was packed with spectators, curious townspeople drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Garrett Ashford sat in the front row, his face cold and set, radiating the kind of righteous anger that came from genuine belief in his cause. Xander sat beside Sabrina at the defense table, his presence a silent promise of support. The prosecution went first, presenting their case with practiced efficiency. They called witnesses who spoke about Thomas's good character, his generosity to friends, his love for his family. They presented evidence that Sabrina had fled the scene, suggesting consciousness of guilt. They argued that a woman who truly acted in self-defense would have stayed, would have reported the incident to authorities, would have trusted the law to protect her. Morrison's cross-examinations were devastating. He got Thomas's friends to admit under oath that they'd seen him drunk and violent. He questioned why a generous, loving man would need to drink himself into oblivion most nights. He established that Sabrina had no criminal history, no history of violence, no motive beyond survival. When the defense presented their case, Morrison called witness after witness who testified to the abuse. Helen Murphy spoke with quiet conviction about the sounds she'd heard, the fear she'd seen in Sabrina's eyes. The doctor described the injuries he'd treated, the pattern consistent with repeated domestic violence. A shopkeeper testified that Thomas had once beaten Sabrina in public when she'd allegedly bought the wrong kind of tobacco. And finally, Morrison called Sabrina herself to the stand. She looked small sitting there, dwarfed by the witness chair and the weight of all those watching eyes. But her voice was steady as she swore to tell the truth, and Xander felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to his eyes. Morrison led her through her testimony with gentle precision, establishing the timeline of her marriage, the escalating violence, the isolation and fear that had defined her life. Sabrina didn't embellish or dramatize. She simply told the truth in clear, factual sentences that were somehow more powerful than any emotional appeal could have been. And on the day Thomas died, Morrison asked, "What happened?" He'd been drinking for 2 days. I asked him to help with chores, and he became enraged. He grabbed a fire poker and said he was going to kill me. I believed him. He'd made that threat before, and his eyes had this look like he wasn't quite human anymore. So I grabbed the rifle and told him to back off. He laughed and kept coming, and I shot him. Did you intend to kill him? I intended to stop him from killing me. If that meant his death, then yes, I intended it, because I wanted to live. Her voice broke slightly. I wanted to live, and he wanted to take that from me, so I made a choice. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal, trying to paint Sabrina as manipulative, as a liar, as a woman who'd planned the murder all along. But she held firm, never deviating from her story, never losing her composure. And when it was over, when she stepped down from the stand and returned to her seat beside Xander, he took her hand and held it tight. The closing arguments took most of the next day. Morrison was eloquent and passionate, arguing that the law's failure to protect women from domestic violence left them no choice but to protect themselves. He pointed out that if the genders had been reversed, if a man had killed an abusive wife in self-defense, no charges would have been filed. He asked the jury to see past their prejudices and recognize Sabrina Ashford as what she truly was, a survivor who'd been forced to make an impossible choice. The prosecution countered that the law was the law, that marriage was sacred, that allowing women to kill their husbands and claim self-defense would destroy the fabric of society. They painted a picture of chaos and murder justified by false claims of abuse. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days during which Xander and Sabrina barely ate or slept, waiting in their small house for word that a verdict had been reached. Morrison stopped by each evening with updates. The jury had asked for certain testimonies to be read back. They'd requested clarification on the legal definition of self-defense. They were split and arguing. Finally, on a cold afternoon in late October, word came that the jury had reached a decision. They rushed to the courthouse, taking their seats just as the jury filed back into the courtroom. Xander studied their faces, trying to read their expressions, but found nothing conclusive. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man with a weathered face who'd spent the trial looking troubled. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman nodded. In the case of the Territory of Idaho versus Sabrina Ashford, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted in noise, gasps and shouts, and the pounding of the judge's gavel calling for order. But Xander heard none of it. He was too focused on Sabrina, who'd collapsed against him sobbing with relief. He wrapped his arms around her, held her while she shook with the release of a year's worth of fear and tension. Morrison was grinning, shaking hands with the jury members as they filed out. Garrett Ashford sat rigid with fury, his face purple, but he didn't matter anymore. The law had spoken, and Sabrina was free. That evening they celebrated at Morrison's office, drinking whiskey and laughing with the kind of manic energy that follows extreme stress. Morrison raised his glass in a toast. To justice, however delayed, and to 2 of the bravest people I've ever met. We couldn't have done it without you, Sabrina said, her eyes still red from crying. Thank you for believing me when nobody else did. Just doing my job, though I'll admit this case will do wonders for my reputation. Morrison's smile was warm. What will you do now? The charges are dismissed. You're free to go anywhere. Sabrina looked at Xander, and he saw the question in her eyes. He answered by pulling her close and pressing a kiss to her temple. We're going home, to our cabin in the mountains. We've had enough of civilization for a while. Can't say I blame you. Morrison poured another round. But if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. They left Boise 3 days later, their few possessions packed and their hearts lighter than they'd been in months. The ride back to the cabin felt like a homecoming, each mile bringing them closer to the peace they'd been denied. The mountains were already deep in snow, and they had to use snowshoes for the last 5 miles, but neither complained. The cabin appeared like a vision through the falling snow, exactly as they'd left it, and Xander had never been so glad to see anything in his life. That first night back, they made love by the fire with a desperation born of relief and joy, and the knowledge that they were finally, truly free. No more running, no more looking over their shoulders, just the 2 of them and the life they'd chosen. Winter passed in a blur of contentment. They fell back into their routines, hunting and reading and talking late into the night. But something was different now. The specter of Sabrina's past no longer hung over them, and they could plan for a future without fear. They talked about children, about maybe building a larger cabin, about the bounties they'd take come spring and the life they'd build between hunts. Spring arrived in late April, bringing green shoots and running water and the return of elk to the meadows. They made their first trip to Silver City in early May, restocking supplies and checking for news. The town buzzed with gossip about Sabrina's trial and acquittal, and she was recognized immediately. But instead of hostility, they found respect and even admiration. The women, especially, looked at her with something like awe, as if she'd done something they'd only dreamed of. It was in Silver City that Xander finally saw another wanted poster for Frank Holly's. The bounty had increased to $5,000, and there were reports he'd been seen in Montana Territory, still running. Xander showed it to Sabrina, expecting her to want to go after him immediately. Instead, she surprised him by shaking her head. "Not yet. We've got something more important to take care of first." "What's that?" She took his hand, placed it over her stomach, and smiled. "We're going to have a baby." Xander froze, his mind going blank with shock and then flooding with emotion so intense he couldn't speak. A baby. Their baby. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the street, pressing his face against her stomach, and felt her hands stroke through his hair. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He looked up at her, saw the love and hope shining in her eyes, and knew that whatever else happened, they'd face it together. "When?" "Late autumn, I think. September or October." They rode back to the cabin immediately, Xander insisting on a slower pace despite Sabrina's protests that she was fine. He spent the summer in a state of protective concern that would have been annoying if it wasn't so endearing, constantly checking on her, making sure she didn't overwork, bringing her wildflowers and treats from town. Sabrina tolerated it with good-natured exasperation, reminding him that she'd survived worse than pregnancy. The baby came in late September during an early snowstorm, and Xander delivered his son with hands that shook, despite his best efforts at calm. The infant was perfect, tiny and red and screaming with impressive lungs, and when Sabrina cradled him against her chest, tears streaming down her face, Xander felt something break open in his chest. "What should we name him?" Sabrina asked, exhausted but glowing. Xander thought of his sister Mary, of the baby she'd lost, of the redemption he'd found in these mountains. "What about Marcus? It means warrior, seems fitting." "Marcus Dalton, I like it." She looked up at him. "We did it. We built something real. We did." He kissed her forehead, then his son's, and silently thanked whatever power had brought them together. "And we're going to keep building it. Together." The years that followed were full and rich, marked by the simple pleasures of family life and the occasional bounty hunt when they needed money or missed the excitement. Marcus grew strong and healthy, learning to track and shoot under his father's patient instruction, learning compassion and justice from his mother's example. 2 years after Marcus came a daughter they named Sarah, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes. They expanded the cabin to accommodate their growing family, adding rooms and a proper barn. Other families moved into the valley, drawn by the Daltons' reputation for fairness and competence, and soon there was a small community nestled in the mountains. Xander, who'd once craved solitude above all else, found he didn't mind having neighbors, not when they respected boundaries and Sabrina's laughter filled his home. Frank Holly's was eventually caught by other bounty hunters, dying in a shootout rather than face trial. Xander read about it in a newspaper and felt nothing but relief that the man who tried to hurt Sabrina was finally gone. There were always other outlaws, other bounties, but they were selective now, taking only the jobs that mattered and spending the rest of their time with their children. On their 10th anniversary, Xander took Sabrina back to the clearing where they'd made their first camp together. The aspens were golden with autumn, and the air held the crisp promise of winter. They spread a blanket and sat close, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their entire love story. "You ever regret it?" Sabrina asked. "Giving up your solitude for all this chaos?" "Not for a single second." He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her. "You saved me, Sabrina. I didn't even know I needed saving, but you walked into that saloon and changed everything. Pretty sure it was mutual." She tilted her head back to look at him. "I love you, Xander Dalton. Thank you for burning that poster. Thank you for choosing me over the bounty. That was the easiest decision I ever made." He kissed her, slow and deep, pouring a decade of love and gratitude into it. When they finally broke apart, he smiled. "And I'd make it again every single time." They stayed in that clearing until the stars came out, talking about their children and their dreams and the life they'd built from the ashes of their separate traumas. And when they finally rode back to the cabin, to Marcus and Sarah waiting with their grandmother Helen Murphy, who'd moved in to help with the children, Xander felt the same peace he'd felt that first night when Sabrina had agreed to stay. He'd spent years alone in these mountains, searching for something he couldn't name. And in the end, it had walked into his life wearing men's trousers and carrying a rifle, with fire in her eyes and courage in her heart. She'd shown him that love wasn't weakness but strength, that opening yourself to another person was the bravest thing you could do. The mountain man had found his home, and it wasn't in the wilderness or the solitude he'd cherished. It was in the woman who slept beside him every night, in the children they'd created together, in the community they'd built. And as he drifted to sleep that night, Sabrina warm against his side and his children sleeping safely in the next room, Xander Dalton knew he was exactly where he belonged. Years continued to roll by in their mountain valley, each season bringing its own rhythm and challenges. Marcus grew tall and strong like his father, with the same quiet competence and protective nature. By 15, he was an excellent tracker and shot, though he showed more interest in ranching than bounty hunting. Sarah, at 13, had inherited her mother's sharp mind and fierce determination, along with an artistic talent neither parent could account for. She filled the cabin with drawings and paintings of the mountains, the wildlife, the family she loved. Xander and Sabrina took fewer bounties as the years passed, content to let younger hunters claim the dangerous work. They'd earned enough to buy more land, to build a proper ranch that could support their family without the risk of chasing outlaws. But they never forgot where they'd come from or the work that had brought them together. On the 20th anniversary of the day Xander had torn down that poster and burned it, they gathered their family around the fire for a story. Marcus and Sarah had heard bits and pieces over the years, but never the full tale of how their parents had met and fallen in love. Sabrina told it, with Xander filling in details she missed, painting a picture of two damaged people who'd found healing in each other. She didn't shy away from the hard parts: the abuse she'd suffered, the murder she'd committed, the trial that had nearly destroyed them. But she also talked about the love that had sustained them, the choice Xander had made to believe in her even when the law said she was guilty. "Your father could have collected $5,000 by turning me in," Sabrina said, looking at her children with solemn eyes. "Instead, he burned the poster and declared that I was worth more than any bounty. That single act of faith changed my life. It gave me hope when I had none, and it showed me what real love looked like." "That's so romantic," Sarah breathed, her eyes shining. Marcus looked more practical. "But what if you'd been wrong about each other? What if Mom had actually been a murderer, or what if Dad had decided the money was more important? Then we would have lived different lives, Xander said, but we weren't wrong. We saw each other truly, past the fear and the damage, to the people we actually were. That's what love is, choosing to believe the best in someone even when the world says otherwise. Helen Murphy, now in her 60s and still sharp as ever, raised her glass. To choices that change lives. And to the bravest couple I've ever known. They toasted, and the conversation turned to lighter topics: Marcus's plans to expand the herd come spring, Sarah's dreams of studying art in San Francisco, the new families moving into the valley. But later that night, when the children were asleep and Helen had retired to her room, Xander and Sabrina stood on the porch looking out at the moonlit mountains. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked into that saloon?" Sabrina asked. "Sometimes. But then I remember I don't believe in fate or destiny. I believe in choices, and every day I choose you." He pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Every single day. Even when I'm old and gray and can't shoot straight anymore, especially then. Though knowing you, you'll probably outshoot me until we're both in the ground." She laughed, the sound rich and warm in the cold night air. "I love you, Xander Dalton. Thank you for giving me a life worth living. Thank you for giving me a reason to live." He kissed her temple, then her cheek, then her mouth, sealing the promise they'd made 20 years ago and renewed every day since. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other and the peace of their mountain home. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and closer by, an owl called to its mate. The sounds of the wilderness they'd both come to love, the wild spaces that had sheltered and sustained them through every trial. The mountain man and his bounty hunter had built something extraordinary here, a love that had survived impossible odds, a family that thrived against the harshest elements, a home carved from raw wilderness and sheer determination. And as they finally went inside, closing the door against the cold, Xander knew that this was the greatest treasure he'd ever claimed. Not gold or bounties or solitude or peace, but love, freely given and fiercely protected. Love that was worth more than any price on any poster, then and forever.